called by their name. Resuming debate, the honourable member for Scarborough Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I will be splitting my time today with my friend, the honourable member for Scarborough-Guildwood. I rise today to speak on Bill C-71, an act to amend certain acts and regulations with relation to firearms. It is appropriate that this is the first topic of my speech in this place following my return from medical leave, as while I was away, a series of unfortunate and sad acts of violence involving firearms across Toronto have driven home to our community the cost of firearms violence, how they ripple across the community beyond just the victims and their loved ones, and the need for new ideas and a new approach to combating firearms violence. We can talk about statistics. Mr. Speaker, I can tell on how in 2016 there were 223 firearms-related homicides in Canada, a 23% increase from 2015 and the highest rate since 2005. Between 2013 and 16, the number of female intimate partner violence victims for whom a firearm was present during the incident increased from 447 to 586. But statistics, while important for context, cannot alone illustrate the emotional, the physical, the psychological toll these acts of violence leave in their wake. I would like to highlight 3 recent acts of firearms violence that have shook my own community of Scarborough Centre in recent months. In fact, 2 incidents have taken place in the last 2 weeks within days of one another. A week ago tomorrow, last Friday night, a 16-year-old boy was shot and died on Bellamy Road North. This wasn't a case of being in a dangerous area late at night. He was in front of an apartment building in the early evening. Police responded to reports of gunshots around 6:45 p.m. Neighbors say this was a good kid not involved in any bad activities. Perhaps a case of mistaken identity. This young man who lost his life at the age of 16 will never finish high school, will never have the chance to go to college or university, will never have the chance to pursue his dreams. He was Toronto's 77th homicide victim of the year. But behind that statistics is a life that will never be. Just a little more than a week earlier, on September 4th, the day our kids went back to school after Labor Day, a woman's life was forever changed on a Tuesday evening in her own home on Birchmount Road near Ellesmere Road. Emergency crews were called to a basement apartment just after 10 p.m. to a private residence to find a woman believed to be in her 50s with a gunshot-related injuries. There was no one around, and because of her injuries, she was unable to communicate to the responding officers what had happened. She had been shot in the neck, and thanks to the efforts of the first responders and the medical professionals at the nearby trauma center, she will survive. But she has suffered life-altering injuries and could be left paralyzed. And another life dramatically changed by an act of firearms violence. And in May, there was another incident of senseless gun violence that hit close to home. It happened next door in Scarborough-Guildwood, but the victim and his family are from Scarborough Centre. On May 21st, around 3 a.m., an 18-year-old was shot dead and a 17-year-old suffered life-altering injuries when they were shot in their car in the Scarborough Golf Club Road area near Ellesmere Road. Neighbors were shocked and call it a quiet neighborhood. Police say they believe it was a targeted shooting. The 18-year-old victim was named Mohammed Garda. He was Toronto's 30th homicide of the year. The survivor's family has asked that his name not be released. I visited him and his family at Sunnybrook Trauma Center in the days following the incident. He faces a long and difficult road to recovery and has lost his vision in one eye. Mr. Speaker, these are just 3 incidents out of many that have touched my community and has touched Toronto. There have been others, too many others. Between the incident in May and the one last week, 47 more people were murdered in Toronto. As a mother of 2 young men now attending university, I think of how I would react if I got that phone call, if the promise their lives hold, if the dreams my husband and I have for them were suddenly to be extinguished. Just another statistic. Behind every number is a story, a grieving family, a life snuffed out. Too many of the victims are youths, with their whole lives ahead of them, future teachers, future doctors, future scientists. Who knows what they could have accomplished, what they could have achieved, what they could have contributed to our community and to the world. I would consider Bill C-71, which we are debating here today, to be a common sense bill. It's a first step that contains a number of provisions related to firearm safety that certainly make sense to me and are worthy of our consideration and of our support. It is not our intention in any way to penalize law-abiding firearms owners, but merely to put in place regulation and policy that helps ensure only those law-abiding citizens have access to firearms and that they use them in a responsible manner. As with many others in our society, Mr. Speaker, it is about balancing rights and responsibilities and the interests of public safety. With enhanced background checks, for example, we are making sure only responsible people can become firearm owners. Currently, only the last 5 years can be considered while making a decision to grant a firearms license. We will remove that 5-year limitation so that if a person has committed one of several listed criminal offenses, been treated for mental illness associated with violence, or has a history of violent behavior, that information can be considered. I find that hard to argue with, Mr. Speaker. We should be diligent when considering who can and will be responsible firearms owner. With Bill C-71, we are also seeking to close a loophole around license verifications. Before 2015, if an individual or a retailer was selling a firearm, they had to verify the purchaser had a valid possession and acquisition license, or PAL. Basically, they had to make sure they were legally licensed to own a firearm. The last government changed that too, and I quote, "The transfer has no reason to believe that the transferee is not authorized to acquire and possess that kind of firearm," end quote. Basically, they were asked to take the person's word for it. That's fine if the buyer is indeed a responsible and licensed firearms owner. But as we know, irresponsible people try to get their hands on firearms too. By returning to the pre-2015 system, sellers will need to make a call to the firearms registry to verify the seller's PAL. It will take less than 5 minutes, cost nothing to the seller or the buyer, and will close one loophole that could allow firearms to enter the wrong hands. We are also strengthening the requirements for vendor record keeping. Most vendors already track sales information, but there is no requirement that they do so. Provincial governments used to require record keeping as a condition of obtaining a license to sell firearms, but the last government prohibited them from making that a requirement of license in 2011. We will again make record keeping a federal requirement. It is important to note that this information will not be available to police except through a court-ordered search warrant obtained in support of an active investigation. I think we can trust our courts and make the right decision here. I would note that this is also the federal policy in the United States. And finally, Mr. Speaker, another provision I would like to highlight is weapons classification. The Conservative government took decision-making ability for firearms classification decision away from the experts at the RCMP and instead turned it over to the federal cabinet. Mr. Speaker, let me be clear that I have great faith in my capable colleagues who serve Her Majesty in her cabinet. However, they are not firearm experts, and I don't think such decisions should be made by a group subject to political whims and pressure. By returning this classification authority to the RCMP to operate based on law passed by the people's elected representatives in this parliament, we are removing political interference from the equation and ensuring that evidence-based decisions are made by independent experts. Mr. Speaker, as I said earlier, I believe Bill C-71 is an important first step on common sense firearm safety, and I will be supporting, but I believe we need to do more. My constituents in Scarborough Centre want us to do more. We need to look at why so many young people turn to violence. Too many people have lost their lives to firearms violence. I think we can and we must do better. We can and we must do more. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for